I was asked to babysit a washing machine. Pardon? I responded incredulously. 200 pounds per hour, Susan repeated. Yeah, I replied. But you said I'd be babysitting a… No, I must have misheard you. Where's the child? Child? Stephen laughed. We don't have children. You heard me correctly, George. Just watch the machine for a few hours, Susan said. That's all, isn't it, Stephen? Indeed, Susan, Stephen chuckled. Honestly, this new generation. You'd think they could handle babysitting a washing machine, wouldn't you? You would, Susan laughed. Perhaps we should write it on a piece of paper for him. He probably needs to be told through the medium of TikTok, Stephen said. The pair of them laughed, and I stifled the irritated huff that was itching to emerge from my tightly compressed lips. They were insufferable, but 200 pounds per hour of babysitting was a staggering offer. It would have been staggering if I'd been offered that much to care for an actual person. But a washing machine? Let them have their fun, I thought. I was certain I'd have the last laugh. And so I bit my tongue. No, I said, smiling. I think I've got it. Good lad, Stephen said, ruffling my hair in a patronizing fashion. May I take your coat? I shrugged, but Stephen had already slipped it off my shoulders before I could respond. He disappeared upstairs, which seemed a little peculiar, given they had a coat stand by the door, but I didn't question it. We'll see you at 11 o'clock, okay? Susan asked. I nodded, waving as they left. I lifted a middle finger as soon as the door had shut behind them. I was about to make the easiest 800 pounds of my life. Maybe more if they stay out longer, I thought. Stephen and Susan Hall had always been the oddballs of the street. Nobody really knew them. And despite their insistence to the contrary, I could have sworn they had kids, Tim and Rachel. Mom and Dad seemed to think not, which is they were confused when the Halls offered me the babysitting gig over the Christmas break. When I found myself eyeballing a washing machine in their kitchen, I started to realize that my parents were probably right. There had never been a Tim or a Rachel. But I wasn't complaining about the bizarre request. As a broke university student, the thought of making eye-watering money in a single night had me salivating in seconds. As soon as the Halls popped round to make the offer, I rushed over to their house at the end of the street without another thought. Anyway, after that rude conversation with the Halls, I initially planned to not even bother babysitting the washing machine. But I was so glad I eventually peered through the oval window because I was treated to a sight of unexpected hilarity. A mountain of miniature outfits circled the rumbling drum. There must have been hundreds of items in there, all of them too small for any human to wear. And some were far more shrunken than others. It was a mismatched collection. Of course they're washing doll clothing, I thought, laughing aloud. Absolute nut jobs. Of course I immediately sent pictures to my friends. No way, Johnny replied. Those two are so weird. I can't believe you're not babysitting actual humans. Didn't we play with their kids when we were growing up? Sarah asked. That's what I said to my parents, I replied. But they didn't think so. And Stephen and Susan said they don't have any children. Oh, but they do, Johnny said. Their beautiful baby washing machine. I snorted. Also, I'm just thinking about the photos you sent, Johnny continued. I think I recognize that teensy tiny t-shirt in the second picture, the one with the green turtle on it. See it? Oh my word, Tim wore that. Well, a larger version of that, Sarah messaged. Yeah, that name rings a bell, Johnny said. My heart dropped. Wait, Tim? Okay, this is getting weird now. I was part joking about them having kids, but that's the exact name I had in my head. Before my friends could respond, the doorbell rang. The sudden ding startled me, and my phone clattered to the tiles below, screen shattering dramatically. I groaned. Of course. I scooped up my wounded technological appendage, sighed at the screen I could no longer read, and placed the fallen soldier on the dining table. I stormed to the front of the house, ready to scowl at whoever had unwittingly caused my phone's demise. But when I flung the door open, nobody was there. Though I was certain I could hear a faint wailing sound in the wind, as if a distant scream were striving to capture my attention. With a heavy sigh, I closed the door and returned to the kitchen, frustrated that a sizable portion of the night's earnings would be going towards fixing my phone screen. I squinted at the device's splintered screen, but it was useless. I couldn't read what my friends had replied. Suddenly, my attention diverted to an unusual noise from the washing machine's innards, a sound that was hard to distinguish, though it had some sort of subconscious effect on my body, lining my skin with a wave of goosebumps and upright hairs, much like the wailing wind at the front door. It sounded like a chorus of piercing shrieks. I knelt onto the kitchen tiles, sighing as my jeans pressed into shattered pieces of my phone screen, and stared deeply into the whirlpool of minuscule clothes which filled the washing machine. The rumble of the drum, the rustling of a tire, and the whooshes of water mostly drowned out the mysterious noise. But it was there. I hadn't imagined it. A choral pang of despair. And then I saw something which filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A fleshy creature, half the size of a pinky finger, slithered between two items of clothing. I yelled and immediately fell backwards, unable to pinpoint what I had seen, but entirely certain it was no insect. No animal. I hurriedly smashed every button on the washing machine, desperate to end the cycle. I'm not sure why my instinct wasn't to run. My brain wasn't functioning correctly. I waited a few minutes for the water to drain from the drum, watching the still pile of tiny outfits. My body shook violently, anticipating movement from within the clothing. But there was nothing. No fleshy monstrosity pounced out at me. And then there came the dreaded ding to signify that the door was safe to open. The drenched pile of clothes sat motionlessly, and I spent several minutes summoning the courage to rummage through it. The never-ending piercing sound was louder now. It was a muffled noise coming from the bottom of the clothes pile. I scarcely dared to look. Shrunken garments slipped through my fingers, and it was only upon closer inspection that I came to a horrifying realization. The outfits were stained with blood and some sort of indistinguishable mush. I could feel the vomit rising in my mouth, but I was as I uncovered the final layer of clothes at the bottom of the drum that I finally unloaded the contents of my stomach. A graveyard of flesh lay against the drum. There were hundreds of shrunken bodies, horribly disfigured, bloodied, and mushed. But the worst part was that some of the miniaturized victims were still moving. The indiscernible peach-colored things were people, and the piercing choral sound was that of their screaming. One of the less mangled people began to crawl over the smaller mound of clothes I'd created in the clearing. He was calling to me in a small, feeble voice. "Save us! Help!" he cried repeatedly. I watched in paralyzed fear, trying to decide whether it would be safe for me to reach the palm of my hand inside the drum to scoop out the few people still moving. The man who had wriggled free from the mound of bodies seemed wounded and helpless, but I was terrified of touching that horror scene. With a deep breath, I outstretched my hand, placing it palm side up on the clothes at the bottom. And as the tiny man, along with a few other survivors, clambered onto my skin, I tried to conceal the shivers that spread throughout my body. The first man continued to shout as I steadily lifted my hand closer to my ear. But I soon realized I'd misheard him the first time. "Not save us. Not save. Help! Save yourself!" "What's happening?" I whispered weakly. "What? Didn't you see Grace outside?" The man screamed into my ear. My body shivered as I realized that must have been who rang the doorbell, the tiny voice I heard wailing in the wind. "It doesn't matter now. Just find your coat and get out of here," he screeched in a minute voice. "Why do I need my coat?" I asked, gulping. "Because they'll shrink it to shrink you. I don't know how or why they do it, but it happened to all of us." I moved my hand to eye level, surveying the 6 survivors, 5 of whom were writhing on my palm. Only the main man seemed to be in any sort of fit state. Are you Tim?" I asked quietly. "What? Oh, the boy," he sighed. "No, the Halls put their children somewhere special. Never mind that. Come on, you need to find your coat." I looked at the clock on the wall. "Relax, it's 8 o'clock, they're not getting back until 11. "They never went anywhere," the man screamed. In a near-synchronized manner, the house's lights extinguished. "Oh no," the small man whispered. "They know." "I'm getting out of here," I said, stumbling through the darkness. "If you leave, that coat goes in the next cycle and you become like us," the man warned. "Or worse." And I didn't need to question what he meant. I'd seen the pulverized bodies at the bottom of the drum. Given the inexplicable nature of the tiny human in the palm of my hand, I had reason to believe every last word he'd said. So I made my way across the darkened entryway, opened the front door, and placed the miniature figures on the paving slabs. "Go," I said. I could hear faint, pained sounds from the ground as the man said something inaudible to me before helping his injured companions. Then, I stepped back into the lightless house, pulling out my shattered phone to use the flashlight. Thankfully, the screen still seemed to register my touch. Making my way up creaking stairs, the stillness of the house filled me with absolute terror, given I knew that the Halls were lurking somewhere within those 4 walls. And when I reached the upstairs landing, a door opened at the far end. A darkened bedroom beckoned. I knew it to be a trap, but I had no choice, according to the small man I had saved. Not that I could trust him either. "Stephen? Sarah?" I called. "I just want my coat. Then I'll go." I stepped into a large, lightless children's room. There were 2 single beds and, most horrifyingly, a doll on each. Dolls that looked exactly like the two children I was completely certain I'd never imagined at all, Tim and Rachel. But they weren't dolls, and they weren't alive. They seemed to have been shrunken and stuffed. I threw up on the floor, and the light in the house suddenly returned as Stephen and Susan entered the room through a side door. "People are so weak these days," Stephen's voice growled. "This generation sickens me." Susan sniffled. "But not our children. They were pure," I cried. "Why are you doing this to people?" "Why?" Stephen frowned, frothing at the lips and brandishing my coat in his tight grip. "To save our children, you ignorant fool. Your life will finally mean something. And seeing as you couldn't even wait for the next washing cycle, I guess we should head downstairs and start it now." You're insane. Save them? Your children are dead. Look at what you've done to them," I cried, gesturing at the doll-sized, pale-faced corpses in the beds. Susan shrieked, "Quiet, you foul thing. We didn't kill them. This was the only way to save them." "Save your energy, honey," Stephen said, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "It's his turn now. And there's no running for him or his escaped friends. We'll catch them. We always do." Heart-pounding, an idea came to me. An idea so horrific that I didn't want to believe it had stemmed from my own brain. I stepped backwards and slammed the bedroom door closed. Then I turned on my heel and ran to the top of the stairs, ignoring the cackling sounds behind me. I scurried down the stairs, 2 at a time, and beelined for the coat stand by the door, scooping up 2 coats, one for Stephen and one for Susan. Hearing footsteps slowly plodding across the upstairs landing, I darted to the kitchen, realizing I had mere moments before I was caught. I threw the coats into the washing machine, ignoring the blood and guts within, and shut the door. "It's useless, George," Stephen shouted, heading down the stairs. "You won't find any weapons in this house, but you can run. Go for it." I pressed the start button and, in a stroke of genius, hammered the plastic handle off the door, preventing it from being opened. Stephen suddenly emerged in the kitchen doorway, coat in hand and frown on his face. "What are you—" He stopped mid-sentence and dropped the coat to the floor. "No! Susan!" I thought I might have to fight them off, allowing the cycle enough time to work its magic. But the horror commenced as soon as their coats began twirling in the running washing machine. As Stephen spun around in the doorway, his limbs began to crumple inwards, shrinking in a matter of seconds. He screamed in excruciating pain, as did Susan, who was still walking down the stairs. Parts of his skin tore and bled, as had been the case for most of the victims in the machine, and there sounded a series of thuds from the staircase. Stephen, mostly crippled and reduced to half of his size, ran out into the entryway, and I followed him. "No, Susan! Susan!" he cried, cradling his shrinking wife who had tumbled to the floorboards and cracked her head open. "What have you done? You monster!" Stephen dropped his wife and turned his attention to me, charging with a furious glint in his eyes. I watched with a mixture of relief and horror as the man lunged forwards, shrinking as he went, and fell at my feet as a shriveled, pinky-sized, lifeless husk wearing blood and guts on the outside of his corpse. I slumped to the floor of the entryway, eyeing the miniature corpses of the halls, making sure they were truly dead. And then, after an unknown period of time, I hazily walked into the kitchen, poured a bottle of vodka across the dining table, and set it ablaze with a lighter. The fire spread quickly. As I was walking towards the open front door, I noticed Stephen's wallet on a dresser. There was 80 pounds inside. Not quite enough for a new phone screen, and certainly not enough compensation for the horror I endured. But it sufficed. I wasn't willing to spend a moment longer in that house. I took my family to a water park. It ruined our lives. "Okay, buddy, we're right here. If you hurry, we can hit the wave pool before we go." I ruffled Will's hair, gave him a little push. He folded his arms, defiant. "The racing slide. It's the funnest one." "Most fun," I corrected. "And whatever you say, Willie." He nodded with umph, satisfied, and scurried off. He weaved his way through the molasses of the crowd, splitting families and couples as he homed in on the dilapidated porta-potty. About 5 minutes after he had gone, I got up. I leaned on a casual arm against the porta-potty, in a whisper shout over the drone of the few hundred happy pool-goers behind me. "Buddy, it's me. How's it going in there?" There was movement inside, I swear it. I swear it wasn't my imagination, I heard something. I turned and saw my wife, Dippin' Dots in one hand and waving with the other. "Can't call it a day at the water park without ice cream." I smiled and wrinkled my nose as a joke. "All right, Will, I'm coming in." The door was unlocked. I made an effort to open it as little as possible and slip inside. I did a double take, turned a full 360, checked the neighboring porta-potty, and returned. No, he couldn't have. I peered down past the toilet seat, Log-sized turds floated in the septic stew below. Will? I stepped outside and circled the porta-potty. Will? I called again. My wife appeared next to me holding Lila's hand. What happened? Where's Will? She asked. I don't know, he was inside. Lila, did you see him leave at all? My daughter shook her head, thrusting a spoonful of dots into her mouth. You were supposed to be watching him, my wife said. I know. I grabbed the arm of a man nearby. Excuse me, sir, did you see my son leave this porta-potty here? I described Will in detail. He saw the desperation in my eyes but shook his head. Sorry, try the lifeguard station. I'm sure this happens all the time. He wished us luck and I thanked him. My wife was beginning to cry. She was starting to scare Lila. I ran ahead, cutting through one of the splash pads and hopping the fence to the lifeguard station. Oh, excuse me, sir. Some acne-riddled teenager with a red and white uniform stood up from behind the desk. My son, I can't find my son. Is there some announcement you can make, something? The teen closed his eyes. Yeah, give me 1 sec. I'm kind of new, so I think... I don't have a second. If you can't help, then get me a goddamn manager, I snarled. A petite girl, also in high school by the looks of it, turned the corner, oblivious to the nature of the conversation. Hey, you can't talk to him like that, she pouted. There's no need to be rude. I stabbed my finger at her, my temper at the end of its wick. I'll be as rude as I damn well like. Get me a fucking manager or I'll go back there and find one. The police were called. Primarily for me. I was screaming, knocking things over, foaming at the mouth, my wife said. The cops said I would have to calm down or they'd handcuff me. They sent out an announcement over the park's PA system. William, your parents are looking for you at the lifeguard station. If you can find a lifeguard, we can get you back together as soon as possible. Don't worry, the lifeguard manager said. We radioed all our employees. He'll be back in no time at all. As it turns out, lost and found children in places like these is fairly common. The problem was, Will never turned up. How do you go home after that? We stayed as long as we could, but it's not like we could sleep on the slides. So the same day I left for the water park with my family, we returned. One short. Lila didn't know what was happening. We told her Will had gotten lost and the police were looking for him. She asked why we weren't looking for him. She began to cry. The funny thing about humans is how simultaneously effective and ineffective we are at lying to ourselves. Because a deep part of yourself, something in your core where you know you can trust it, smells the bullshit. And yet we'll take that lie and run, far as we can, until our legs give out or we crash face first into a wall. After the first day, that piece of me in my core knew I'd never see Will again. But I ran like hell. My lust for closure deflated my marriage like a water balloon with a leak. I was stupid to think I wouldn't get laughed out of the court during custody proceedings. But the one reprieve I had came yesterday. If I couldn't have answers, if I couldn't have my family or my son back, then I'd have some sweet revenge. This last year, I'd been leading media campaigns, doing interviews, degrading myself to what I used to frown on and call an activist. All to destroy the water park that took my son. The park was small, got a lot of bad press in the local outlets where most of their customers were. Apparently, this wasn't the first incident in the park's history. Far from it, actually, having a long list of lawsuits and scandals. But it was the last straw, and eventually they were forced to close. Yesterday was the first day of the demolition. I watched it in person. One-man audience. And it felt good. I was getting ready to leave around midday when a commotion in the site held me. Axe! Grab the axe! The crew was in mayhem, and advantageous to my curiosity. No one was around to stop me hopping the barrier to get a closer look. It's dead. Stop. It's dead. I was too far to see what the men were standing over and crept closer. Fucker, that's a world record. Call someone. Who? The police. Animal control, call someone, Christ's sake. Where did you find it? In here. Well, go check it. Be careful, too. I felt my way along a bulldozer, close enough now, and stuck my head past the edge. The scene made my knees buckle. I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. Dead and covered in hacks and slash marks was a python. Never mind a snake, it was the largest animal I'd even seen up close. Long as a school bus, longer even, stretched out. Despite its size, it looked thin, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Tell me what happened, one of the construction crew asked a younger member. We was using the machine and clearing the area like you said. Went and knocked over them porta-potties and the dragon came rearing its head. Out one of them holes beneath. The crew began to buzz, taking pictures of the beast and kicking it. The construction man nodded and called for the worker who had gone to check the hole. Come on out. That's a shithole, nothing to find. Be boss. The site fell silent. What is it? There's bones. There's bones down here. I woke up screaming the next morning. Wandered around the house until I went for the newspaper. After all the pieces were collected, the bones they found belonged to 10 unique skeletons. It was a reticulated python, the invasive one, 26 feet long. Found the humidity of the park nice and chose a place it wouldn't be found. Headlined the local paper for a day before it was pulled. Previous owners of the park still had some influence in the area. And what did I get? Closure? I would have rather been buried with my unanswered questions.